Tonight, on Gay Timeline, we are turning back the clock to Berlin, 1919. The war is over, the Kaiser has fled, and in the smoking wreckage of an empire, something impossible is about to bloom. A city where two men can dance together in full view of the police, where gay bars advertise in newspapers, where doctors defend homosexuals in court, and journals publish their stories. They had no word for what we would call liberation, but they built it anyway. And tonight, we say their names out loud, because they could not. I am Julian. This is Gay Timeline. In 1919, on a cold November night in Berlin, a man named Friedrich Radszuweit walked into a dance hall on Kommandantenstrasse. He was 41. He had survived the trenches, and he was about to do something that would have been unthinkable 4 years earlier. He was going to dance with another man in public. The band played. The floor filled. And no one stopped him. If you find yourself drawn into this story, the like and subscribe buttons are there for you, but only if this is genuinely your kind of evening. And let me know in the comments where you are tuning in from and what time it is for you. It is always fascinating to see who is joining us from around the world. Now, let us go back to Berlin. For most of history, these men were alone. They wrote letters no one would read. They loved in rooms no one would visit. Tonight, we keep them company. That is all sleep needs to be. A quiet act of refusing to let someone be forgotten. By the end of tonight, you will know why Berlin became the one city in Europe where gay men could live openly, how a street called Unter den Linden became home to more than 40 gay bars, and what was really written on the membership cards men carried in their coat pockets when the police came knocking. Congratulations. You have just woken up in Berlin. The year is 1919. The air smells of coal smoke and cheap tobacco. The streets are full of men in uniforms that no longer mean anything. The currency is collapsing. The government is 3 weeks old, and somewhere in the rubble of the old world, you can hear music coming from a basement on Sossener Strasse. Welcome. Let me tell you what just happened here. 4 years ago, this was the capital of an empire. The Kaiser ruled. The military strutted. Homosexuality was illegal under paragraph 175 of the Penal Code, punishable by prison, and the police kept lists. Then came the war. 4 years of industrial slaughter. 2 million German men died. The empire collapsed. The Kaiser fled to Holland in the middle of the night, and in November 1918, a group of socialists declared Germany a republic. What does the collapse of an empire do to social control? It shatters it. The police were overwhelmed. The courts were backlogged. The old moral authorities, the church, the aristocracy, the military officer corps, had just lost a war so catastrophic it discredited everything they stood for. And into that power vacuum walked a generation of men who had spent 4 years in trenches learning that life is short and the old rules are negotiable. Friedrich Radszuweit was one of them. He had been a printer before the war. He came back in 1918 and found Berlin transformed. The city was flooded with soldiers, refugees, war widows, profiteers, and men who no longer believed in waiting for permission. In early 1919, Radszuweit did something extraordinary. He founded an organization called the Bund für Menschenrecht, the League for Human Rights. It was a membership association for homosexual men, and it was completely legal. Let that sink in for a moment. This is 1919, 50 years before Stonewall, 64 years before the World Health Organization would remove homosexuality from its list of diseases. And a German man is running a gay rights organization out of an office on Möckenstrasse with a sign on the door. The historian Robert Beachy spent years in the Berlin archives tracing what happened next. He found membership records, newsletters, letters. By 1922, the Bund für Menschenrecht had local chapters in more than 20 German cities. It published a magazine called Freundschaft, Friendship. It held dances every Saturday night in rented halls. It lobbied the Reichstag, and at its peak, it had more than 48,000 members. 48,000 men willing to put their names on a membership list for a gay rights organization in 1922. You read that number, and you realize this was not a handful of radicals hiding in basements. This was a mass movement. But Ratsuvite was not the first. And to understand how Berlin became what it became, you have to go back 15 years earlier, to a doctor who decided the law was wrong. His name was Magnus Hirschfeld. In 1897, Magnus Hirschfeld was 30 years old, Jewish, gay, and fascinated by the emerging science of sexology. He had studied medicine in Berlin. He had read the work of Karl Heinrich Ulrichs, the German lawyer who in the 1860s had published the first modern defense of same-sex love, coining the term "earning" for men who loved men. And Hirschfeld believed something radical, that homosexuality was not a crime, not a sin, not a disease, but a natural human variation. And he believed he could prove it scientifically. In 1897, he co-founded the Wissenschaftlich Humanitaires Komitee, the Scientific Humanitarian Committee. It was the first gay rights organization in history. Its mission was simple: abolish paragraph 175. Paragraph 175 was the law that made homosexual acts between men a criminal offense. It had been on the books since 1871, when Bismarck unified Germany. The text was brief, chilling. An unnatural sex act committed between persons of male sex or by humans with animals is punishable by imprisonment. That was it. No definition of what constituted an unnatural sex act. No specification of what evidence was required. Just a blank check for the police to arrest any man they suspected of desiring another man. Hirschfeld spent the next 35 years fighting it. He was not a firebrand. He was not a revolutionary. He was a doctor who believed in data. He conducted surveys, thousands of them. He sent questionnaires to factory workers, students, soldiers, asking them about their sexual desires. And the results showed what he already knew. A significant percentage of the male population, he estimated 10%, experienced same-sex attraction. It was not rare. It was not an aberration. It was simply part of the human spectrum. In 1899, he published a pamphlet arguing for the repeal of paragraph 175. And then he did something no one had done before. He gathered signatures, prominent signatures, artists, writers, scientists, social democrats. He collected more than 6,000 names, including Albert Einstein, Hermann Hesse, Thomas Mann, Rainer Maria Rilke, and eventually submitted petitions to the Reichstag calling for legal reform. The petitions failed. Every time. But the effort itself was extraordinary. Hirschfeld was arguing in public, in newspapers, in medical journals, that gay men deserved legal protection. And he was not arrested for it. The Kaiserreich did not like what he was saying, but it tolerated it, barely, because Hirschfeld framed everything in the language of science and medicine and kept his tone respectful. Then came the war. And after the war, everything changed. By 1919, Hirschfeld was 51, and Berlin was unrecognizable. The Scientific Humanitarian Committee, which had been a small academic society before the war, was suddenly operating in a city where gay men were visible, open, organized. Hirschfeld seized the moment. In 1919, he opened the Institute for Sexual Wissenschaft, the Institute for Sexual Science, in a grand villa on Indenselten near the Tiergarten. It was part clinic, part research library, part museum. Men and women came for consultations. Transgender patients came for some of the first hormone treatments and surgeries in medical history. The institute housed more than 20,000 books and journals on sexuality, the largest collection in the world, and it became the intellectual hub of Berlin's gay world. Walk into the institute in 1920, and you might find Hirschfeld lecturing medical students on homosexuality. You might find a man seeking advice on how to avoid blackmail. You might find Christopher Isherwood, the British novelist, years later, researching his Berlin stories. You might find police officers attending Hirschfeld's public education sessions, learning that the men they had been arresting were not criminals, but simply human. The historian James Stakely documented the Institute's work in forensic detail. He found case files, therapy notes, letters from patients thanking Hirschfeld for saving their lives. And he found something else. Evidence that the Berlin police, by the early 1920s, were sometimes referring gay men to Hirschfeld instead of prosecuting them. Read that again. The police were sending men to a gay rights activist instead of to jail. That is how much the ground had shifted. But the Institute was not the only thing that made Berlin extraordinary. What made Berlin extraordinary was the bars. By 1920, Berlin had more gay bars, clubs, and cafes than any city in the world. No one knows the exact number because new ones opened every month and the police did not keep comprehensive records. But estimates range from 40 to 100 establishments, catering primarily or exclusively to homosexual men. 40 to 100. In one city, in 1920. Let me give you a sense of scale. In 1969, on the eve of Stonewall, New York City, a metropolis of 8 million people, had fewer than a dozen gay bars. And most of those were mob-run, regularly raided, deeply closeted spaces. Berlin in 1925, a city of 4 million, had 10 times that many, and they were not hidden. They advertised. The journalist and novelist Klaus Mann, son of Thomas Mann and himself openly gay, wrote about stumbling into his first Berlin gay bar in 1922. He was 16. He walked into a club called the El Dorado on Motzstrasse and found a room full of men dancing together, drag queens performing on a small stage, and a crowd that included students, soldiers, businessmen, and a few curious tourists. No one checked his age. No one asked if he was a member. The door was simply open. The El Dorado became one of the most famous gay venues in Europe. By the mid-1920s, it was a destination. Marlene Dietrich performed there. Anita Berber, the scandalous dancer, drank there. English and American tourists came to gawk, and the Berlin police knew exactly where it was and did nothing. Why? The answer is complicated, and it speaks to something specific about Weimar Germany that would not last. First, the police were genuinely overwhelmed. Berlin in the 1920s was a city in constant crisis. Political assassinations, street battles between communists and fascists, hyperinflation that turned money into wallpaper. The police had bigger problems than men dancing with men. Paragraph 175 was still on the books, but enforcement required complaints, evidence, court time. And prosecuting consensual adult behavior in private was not a priority when the city was on fire. Second, and this is critical, the Berlin police operated under a principle called the Duldungspolitik, a policy of toleration. It was not official, it was not written down, but it was real. The police tolerated gay bars as long as they were orderly, paid their taxes, and did not cause public scandal. The bars operated in a legal grey zone. Homosexual acts were still criminal, but merely being in a gay space was not. The police drew a line. As long as the bars stayed on the right side of it, they were left alone. Third, the bars had political protection. The Social Democratic Party, which governed Berlin for most of the Weimar period, had a significant liberal wing that opposed paragraph 175. Several SPD Reichstag members publicly supported Hirschfeld's reform campaign, and the SPD-controlled Berlin city government saw the gay bars as part of the city's new cosmopolitan identity. Berlin was marketing itself as the most modern, open, sexually liberated city in Europe. The bars were proof. But there was something else, something deeper, and it had to do with who the men in these bars actually were. Walk into the Kleist Casino on Kleiststrasse in 1924 and look around. You will see men in well-tailored suits. You will see doctors, lawyers, civil servants, journalists, artists. You will see war veterans still wearing their service ribbons. You will see men who, during the day, are respectable members of Weimar society and who at night come here to dance. The historian Florence Tamagne, who spent years reconstructing the social world of interwar European homosexuality, found something striking in the Berlin police reports. Again and again, when the police did raid a gay establishment, the men they arrested were employed, educated, middle class. These were not the usual targets of police harassment. These were men with lawyers, men who could complain to the press, men whose arrests would be embarrassing, and so the police, pragmatic as ever, mostly left them alone. One man who documented this world better than anyone was Adolf Brand. He was a publisher, anarchist, and in 1896 he founded a journal called Der Eigene, the Self-Possessed, It was the first gay magazine in the world. Brand was not like Hirschfeld. He did not argue from science. He argued from aesthetics, from history, from the Greek ideal of male love. Der Eigene published poetry, photography, essays celebrating masculine beauty and the bonds between men. And it ran for 36 years. By the 1920s, Der Eigene had competition. Dozens of gay magazines circulated in Berlin. Die Freundschaft, das Freundschaftsblatt, Die Insel, Ledige Männer. They ranged from highbrow literary journals to practical guides to Berlin nightlife. Some printed coded personal ads. Some published essays on legal reform. Some simply printed photographs of handsome young men, and all of them were sold openly at newsstands. Imagine walking through Berlin in 1925 and stopping at a kiosk. You buy a newspaper, and right next to it, on the rack, is a magazine with two men on the cover, not hiding, not ashamed, just there. That was Berlin. But let me be clear about what this world was and what it was not. It was not equality. Paragraph 175 was still law. Men were still arrested, though less frequently than before. Blackmail was rampant. Blackmailers haunted the parks and bars, threatening to expose men unless they paid. The Berlin police estimated that in the mid-1920s, more than 10,000 blackmail cases involving homosexual men occurred each year. Most were never reported because reporting meant confessing to a crime. It was not safety. The bars could be tolerated one year and raided the next, depending on who was police chief and what political winds were blowing. The Nazi Party, small but growing through the 1920s, denounced the bars as proof of Weimar degeneracy. Their newspaper, the Völkischer Beobachter, ran regular attacks on Hirschfeld, on the Institute, on the homosexual menace. And it was certainly not acceptance. Outside the bars, outside the tolerant neighborhoods of Schöneberg and Tiergarten, Berlin was still a conservative society. Families disowned sons. Employers fired men on suspicion. The church condemned. The medical establishment, apart from Hirschfeld and a handful of allies, still classified homosexuality as pathology. But here is what it was: visible, organized, defended. For the first time in modern history, gay men were not just surviving. They were building institutions. They were publishing. They were arguing in public that they deserved rights. And they were doing it in broad daylight in the capital of a major European power. The historian Robert Beachy argues that Weimar Berlin represented a unique historical moment. The first time a large urban population of gay men lived openly enough, visibly enough, that they could create a self-sustaining culture. Not just bars, but organizations. Not just sex, but community. Not just survival, but politics. And the center of that world, the beating heart of it, was a single Berlin neighborhood: Schöneberg. By 1925, Schöneberg was to gay Berlin what the Marais would later become to Paris, what the Castro would become to San Francisco. It was the neighborhood where the bars clustered, where the magazines had their offices, where men walked arm in arm down Motzstrasse and no one blinked. The main artery was Nollendorfplatz. Stand in Nollendorfplatz at midnight in 1927 and you are standing at the center of the gay world. The El Dorado is 2 blocks west. The Kleist Casino is 3 blocks south. Magnus Hirschfeld's Institute is a 15-minute walk north through the Tiergarten. And all around you are men, not hiding, not pretending, just there. Christopher Isherwood moved to Berlin in 1929 and lived in a boarding house just off Nollendorfplatz. He wrote about it later in his Berlin Stories, which became the basis for Cabaret. He described walking through Schöneberg at night and seeing men greeting each other on street corners, couples holding hands in the dim light of the U-Bahn entrance, bars with their doors propped open and music spilling out onto the pavement. He also wrote something else, something that captures the strangeness, the fragility of what Berlin had become. He said it felt like living in a dream you knew would end. The men around him were euphoric and desperate at the same time. They were living as if tomorrow might take it all away. And they were right, but not yet. Not in 1925. In 1925, Berlin was still becoming more open, not less. The bars were expanding, the organizations were growing, and the political movement to repeal paragraph 175 was closer to success than it had ever been. In 1929, the Reichstag Committee on Penal Law Reform voted 15-13 to recommend the abolition of paragraph 175. 15-13. It was not law yet. The full Reichstag still had to vote. But for the first time in German history, the repeal of the sodomy law was within reach. Magnus Hirschfeld, by then 61, permitted himself a moment of optimism. He had been fighting for 32 years. He had been beaten by nationalist thugs in 1920 and left for dead on a Munich street. He had been mocked in the press. He had watched friends imprisoned. And now, finally, the law might change. He never got to see it happen. But before we get to that, let me take you into one of those bars. Because the statistics and the politics and the legal battles matter, but what really matters is what it felt like to be inside. The bar was called the Mikado. It sat on a side street off Friedrichstrasse, one of Berlin's grand boulevards. The entrance was unmarked. You had to know it was there. But once you walked down the 5 steps into the basement, you entered a different world. The Mikado opened in 1923. It was small, maybe 60 people could fit comfortably, though on Saturday nights it packed in twice that many. The walls were painted dark red. The lighting was low. A piano player sat in the corner, playing everything from Schubert to American jazz, and the crowd was mixed in a way that would have been impossible anywhere else in Europe. You would find students from the university, shop clerks, a journalist from the Berliner Tageblatt, a postal worker still in uniform, a man who worked at the Siemens factory in Spandau, a school teacher who never gave his real name, and in the back corner, usually nursing a cognac, a novelist named Hans Bleuer, who was researching male Bunde, male bonds, for his controversial book on the Wandervogel youth movement. The owner was a man named Otto, last name lost to history. He had opened the Mikado with money saved from years working as a waiter, and he ran it like a careful chess game. He knew every customer by sight. He knew which ones could afford to be seen there and which ones needed discretion. He kept a ledger of regulars hidden under the bar. Not for blackmail, for protection. If the police raided, Otto knew which men had lawyers and which needed to disappear fast. The police did raid occasionally, but never without warning. Berlin in the 1920s ran on tips and bribes. The local precinct captain sent word a few hours in advance. Otto paid a monthly fee, not officially, but everyone understood the system. And in return, the raids were mostly theatre. The police would arrive, check everyone's papers, write a few things down, and leave. No arrests unless someone was spectacularly drunk or causing trouble. That arrangement was fragile. It depended on individual cops who were willing to look the other way. It depended on Otto being careful about noise complaints. It depended on the political mood holding steady. But for a few years, it worked. The regulars at the Mikado were not all there for sex. Some were. There were darker corners, discreet arrangements, hotel addresses exchanged. But many came simply to be in a room where they did not have to perform straightness, where they could talk about the men they loved without coding their pronouns, where they could dance. Dancing was the thing that shocked foreign visitors most. Not that the bars existed, plenty of cities had underground queer spaces, but that in Berlin, men danced with each other in full view, under real lighting, without fear. A British journalist named Douglas Goldring visited Berlin in 1926 and wrote about stumbling into a bar in Schöneberg. He watched 2 men in their 30s, both well-dressed, waltzing slowly to a piano arrangement of Brahms. And what struck him was not the act itself, but the utter ordinariness of it. No one in the bar was staring. No one was scandalized. It was simply 2 people dancing. Goldring wrote that he felt like he had crossed into a future that did not exist yet anywhere else. But the bars were not all like the Mikado. Berlin's gay world was large enough to have subcultures within subcultures. Different bars catered to different classes, different ages, different aesthetics. The Zauberflöte, the magic flute, on Kommandantenstrasse, catered to an older, more bourgeois crowd. Men in their 40s and 50s, professionals, many of them married during the day and discreet at night. The decor was understated. The music was classical. The tone was refined. You did not go to the Zauberflöte to pick someone up. You went to have a civilized drink with people who shared your predicament. The El Dorado, by contrast, was spectacle. Drag queens performed. Tourists came to gawk. By the late 1920s, the El Dorado had become so famous, it was almost a caricature of itself. Tour buses stopped outside. The management leaned into the exoticism. It was profitable, but it also made the space feel less safe. Regulars avoided it. Then there were the working-class bars, smaller, rougher. The Holzplatz in Wedding, the Elbschlösschen in Kreuzberg. These were not destinations. These were neighborhood bars where men who worked with their hands came to drink and, occasionally, to find company. The police harassed these bars more often. Working-class men did not have lawyers. They could not complain to the newspapers, and there were bars specifically for younger men. The Amicitia on Schönhauser Allee had a reputation for a clientele mostly under 30. It was louder, more reckless. The kind of place where someone might get into a fight or make a scene. The older, more cautious men avoided it. But if you were 22 and newly arrived in Berlin from a Bavarian village, the Amicitia was where you went to find people like you. The diversity of the scene is important to understand. This was not one uniform community. It was a city's worth of gay men, fragmented by class and age and respectability politics, all existing in parallel. Some bars tolerated each other. Some looked down on others. The men at the Zauberflöte thought the El Dorado was vulgar. The men at the El Dorado thought the Zauberflöte was boring. The working-class bars thought both were pretentious. But they all existed, and they all knew the others existed. And that mutual awareness, that knowledge that you were not alone in the city, was itself a form of community. One man who navigated this world better than most was a writer named Kurt Hiller. He was a lawyer, a leftist, and the co-founder of a political group called the Aktivisten, the Activists. Hiller was openly gay and unapologetic about it. He wrote essays for the Weltbühne, one of Weimar Germany's most influential left-wing magazines, arguing that homosexual rights were inseparable from broader human rights. In 1921, Hiller gave a speech at a gathering of the Scientific Humanitarian Committee. He stood in front of an audience of about 200 men and said something that had never been said in public before. He said the goal was not just tolerance, not just the repeal of paragraph 175. The goal was pride. He used the German word Stolz, pride. Hiller argued that as long as gay men accepted the framework that their love was unfortunate, pitiable, a condition to be managed, they would never be free. He said the movement needed to stop apologizing, stop asking for sympathy, stop framing homosexuality as a medical anomaly that decent people should tolerate. He said they should demand recognition as equals. The speech was controversial, even within the gay rights movement. Hirschfeld believed in working within existing frameworks, using science and medicine to shift public opinion gradually. Hiller thought that was too slow. He wanted confrontation. The two men respected each other, but disagreed fundamentally on strategy. Hirschfeld thought respectability politics was the only viable path. Hiller thought respectability politics was surrender. Both men were right, and both were wrong, because the thing that would destroy them was not coming from a direction either of them anticipated. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to the streets. If you wanted to meet someone in Berlin and you were not the bar type, you went to the parks. The Tiergarten was the most famous, a sprawling public park in the center of the city, thick with trees, crossed by paths, dotted with benches and dark corners. After dark, it belonged to gay men. The police knew. Everyone knew. The Tiergarten's reputation dated back to the Kaiserreich. But in the 1920s, the police mostly ignored it. As long as no one complained, as long as no one was causing a public disturbance visible from the main paths, the police let it be. Christopher Isherwood wrote about walking through the Tiergarten at night. He described it as a parallel city, men cruising, quiet conversations in multiple languages, a sense of possibility and danger mixed together. He said it felt like a secret that was not actually secret because everyone pretended not to know it, even though they obviously did. But the Tiergarten was not safe. Blackmailers worked the park. They would approach a man, start a conversation, suggest something, and then threaten to report him unless he paid. The threat was real. Even though the police mostly tolerated the park, a formal complaint could still trigger an arrest. And once arrested, your name went on a list. Your employer might be notified. Your family might find out. The blackmailers were called Erpresser, extortionists, and they were a constant presence in the lives of Berlin's gay men. Magnus Hirschfeld wrote about blackmail cases in his journal, the Jahrbuch für Sexuelle Zwischenstufen, the yearbook for intermediate sexual types. He documented hundreds of cases, men bankrupted, men driven to suicide, men whose entire lives were destroyed by a single encounter with the wrong person in the wrong park. The police were not sympathetic. The official position was, if you were not committing a crime, you would not be vulnerable to blackmail. The circular logic was perfect. By making homosexuality criminal, the state created the conditions for blackmail, and then blamed the victims for it. But here is the strange part. Despite the blackmail, despite paragraph 175 still being law, despite the constant background threat of arrest, exposure, ruin, despite all of that, Berlin's gay world kept growing. By 1928, the city had an estimated 100,000 men who participated in the gay scene in some capacity. That number comes from the police, who had reasons to exaggerate, but even if it was half that, it was still an extraordinary concentration. And those men were not just surviving, they were organizing. Friedrich Radschewitz Bund für Menschenrecht had chapters now in over 30 cities. It published multiple magazines. It ran social clubs, sports clubs, even a theatre troupe. In 1928, it held a national conference in Berlin that drew more than 1,000 attendees, openly, in a rented hall, with speeches and resolutions and a group photograph that was published in the gay press. Look at that photograph. Men in suits, serious expressions, some looking directly at the camera, some with their arms around each other. It is one of the most remarkable documents from the period. Because these are not people hiding. These are people claiming space. There were also women. Let me be clear about that. Berlin's lesbian world was smaller, less documented, more closeted in some ways, and more open in others. The bars that catered to women were fewer, maybe a dozen, and the police harassed them differently. Lesbianism was not technically illegal. Paragraph 175 only applied to men, but that did not mean women were safe. Women could be arrested for public indecency, for cross-dressing, for disturbing the peace, and women had fewer economic resources. Fewer independent women owned property, earned enough to live alone, had the freedom to spend their evenings in bars, but they were there. The Dorian Gray on Bülowstrasse, the Silhouette near Nollendorfplatz, the Café Olala in Charlottenburg. These were spaces where women danced with women, where masculine presenting women in tailored suits were celebrated, where actresses and artists and women who worked in the city's offices came to find each other. The writer Ruth Margarete Roehlig published a guidebook in 1928 called Berlin's Lesbische Frauen, Berlin's Lesbian Women. It listed the bars, described the atmosphere, gave advice on which spaces were welcoming and which were tourist traps. The fact that such a guidebook could be published and sold openly is itself extraordinary. One woman who moved through this world with particular visibility was Lotte Harm. She performed under the stage name Lotte at the Silhouette. She wore a top hat and tails. She sang risque songs in a low voice, and she was completely open about her relationships with women. The press called her Berlin's boyish girl, which was both a compliment and an insult. She did not care. She packed the silhouette 3 nights a week for most of the 1920s. But the lesbian world was more vulnerable in ways that are easy to overlook. The bars had less political protection. The organizations were smaller. And when the political winds shifted, women's spaces were the first to be shut down because they had fewer members to defend them. Still, for a few years, Berlin had both. And one of the most important things about this period, something historians sometimes miss, is that the gay and lesbian worlds were not entirely separate. They overlapped. They supported each other. Hirschfeld's institute treated both men and women. Radsowite's organization had a women's auxiliary. Several bars, including the El Dorado, were mixed spaces. And the political movement to reform the sex laws argued for the rights of both. That solidarity was unusual. In most of history, gay men and lesbians have organized separately, with separate goals and separate strategies. But in Berlin, for a moment, they were allies. Not perfectly. There were tensions. The male organizations had more money and more political access. The male bars were more numerous and better documented, and some men dismissed the women's movement as less important. But compared to what came before, and compared to most of what came after, Weimar Berlin's queer world was remarkably integrated. Now, the question that hangs over all of this is, why Berlin? Why not Paris? Why not London? Why not Vienna, which was also a cosmopolitan capital with a sophisticated art scene? The answer is a combination of factors, some structural, some accidental. First, Berlin was new. It had only been the capital of a unified Germany since 1871. It did not have centuries of entrenched aristocratic conservatism the way Vienna did. It did not have the smug bourgeois respectability of London. Berlin was a city trying to invent itself. And that openness to reinvention extended to sexuality. Second, Berlin had a specific intellectual tradition. German sexology was the most advanced in the world. Hirschfeld, Krafft-Ebing, Ulrichs, all German-speaking. The idea that sexuality could be studied scientifically rather than simply condemned morally was a German idea. And that intellectual framework gave Berlin's gay rights movement a vocabulary and a legitimacy it did not have elsewhere. Third, Berlin had the Weimar Republic. The collapse of the old order created space for experimentation. The new government was weak, fragmented, constantly on the edge of collapse. It could not enforce social norms the way the Kaiserreich had. And within that chaos, marginalized people found room to breathe. Fourth, Berlin had the SPD. The Social Democrats controlled the city government for most of the Weimar period. And while the SPD was not uniformly pro-gay, it had a significant liberal wing that saw sex law reform as part of the broader progressive project. Several SPD Reichstag members openly supported repealing paragraph 175. That political support mattered enormously. And fifth, Berlin had mass media, newspapers, magazines, radio. The city's gay world was not hidden, it was visible, and visibility created a feedback loop. Men from all over Germany moved to Berlin because they had read about it, because they knew it was possible to live openly there. And as more men arrived, the scene grew, which made it more visible, which attracted more men. By the late 1920s, Berlin was a magnet for queer people from across Europe. But visibility is a double-edged sword. The Nazi Party was watching. Adolf Hitler mentioned homosexuality exactly twice in Mein Kampf. Both references are brief, dismissive. He describes homosexuals as weak, decadent, symptomatic of a society in decline. It is not a major theme of the book. Hitler was far more obsessed with Jews and Marxists. But Ernst Röhm, the head of the Nazi Sturmabteilung, the SA, the paramilitary brownshirts, was openly gay. Everyone knew. Röhm made no secret of it. He frequented gay bars in Munich. He had relationships with young men in the SA. And Hitler did not care. Or at least, he did not care enough to remove Röhm because Röhm was too useful. The SA was the Nazi Party's muscle, and Röhm was loyal. That contradiction, a gay man leading the paramilitary wing of a fascist movement that condemned homosexuality, is one of the strangest elements of the period. Historians still argue about how to interpret it. Some say Hitler was a pragmatist who tolerated Rome's sexuality because he needed him. Some say the Nazi Party's homophobia was less ideological and more opportunistic, deployed when useful and ignored when inconvenient. But whatever Hitler's personal feelings, the Nazi press attacked Berlin's gay world relentlessly. The Völkischer Beobachter, the party newspaper, ran articles with headlines like "The Filth of Berlin" and "Sodom on the Spree." They published the addresses of gay bars. They named names. They framed homosexuality as Jewish decadence, linking Hirschfeld's Jewishness to his activism, suggesting that the entire gay rights movement was a Jewish plot to weaken German masculinity. It was propaganda. Vicious, effective propaganda. And it resonated with Germans outside Berlin who saw the city as proof that the Republic was degenerate, godless, perverted. But here is the thing. In 1928, the Nazis were still a fringe party. They held 12 seats in the Reichstag, 12 out of 491. They were loud, they were violent, but they were not yet powerful. And in 1929, when the Reichstag Committee on Penal Law Reform voted 15-13 to recommend abolishing paragraph 175, it genuinely seemed like the gay rights movement might win. Magnus Hirschfeld testified before the committee. He presented his decades of research. He cited surveys, case studies, expert opinions from psychiatrists, anthropologists, biologists. He argued that homosexuality was innate, not chosen, that it caused no harm to others, that criminalizing it served no public good and caused immense private suffering. The committee was convinced. 15 members supported repeal. The vote was scheduled for the full Reichstag later that year. And then the stock market crashed. October 1929. Wall Street collapsed. The global economy collapsed. Germany, which had been barely holding together on American loans, was devastated. Unemployment spiked. Banks failed. The currency collapsed again. And in the chaos, German politics lurched violently to the extremes. The 1930 Reichstag election was a catastrophe. The Nazi Party went from 12 seats to 107. The Communist Party surged, the centre collapsed. And the vote on paragraph 175 was postponed indefinitely as the Reichstag became paralyzed by constant crises. Hirschfeld watched his life's work slip away in a matter of months. The political coalition that had protected Berlin's gay world fractured. The SPD lost seats. The centrist Catholic parties turned socially conservative to shore up their base. And the Nazis, suddenly a major parliamentary force, made sexual degeneracy a central theme of their rhetoric. They called for the closure of gay bars. They demanded the prosecution of homosexuals. They attacked Hirschfeld by name in the Reichstag. The atmosphere in Berlin changed fast. Not all at once, not overnight. But by 1931, you could feel it. The police raids increased. Not dramatically, but enough. The careful arrangement that had protected bars like the Mikado began to fray. New police chiefs were appointed. Some were sympathetic to the Nazis. Some were just nervous about being seen as too tolerant in a political climate that was hardening. The monthly payments that owners like Otto had been making stopped being enough. Raids started happening without warning. Men were arrested. The bars responded by becoming more cautious. Some installed back exits. Some required membership cards to get in. Some hired lookouts who watched the street for police vans. The El Dorado, which had been flamboyant and open, toned down its performances. The drag queens still performed, but the shows became shorter, less provocative. The management did not want to give anyone an excuse, and the blackmailers multiplied. In an economic depression, extortion became a survival strategy. The parks were no longer safe. Men stopped going to the Tiergarten after dark. Some stopped going to the bars entirely. The fear was not that you would be arrested. The fear was that your name would appear on a list, and that list would be used someday when the political weather got worse. And it was going to get worse. In March 1932, Hitler ran for president. He lost. Hindenburg, the old war hero, won. But Hitler got 37% of the vote. 37% of Germans voted for the Nazi Party. That number should have been a warning. It was a warning. But the traditional conservative parties convinced themselves they could control Hitler. They thought they could use him. They were wrong. But in 1932, there was still a sliver of hope. Berlin's gay world was smaller, quieter, more nervous. But it still existed. The bars were still open. The organizations were still meeting. And some men still believed the worst could be avoided. One of those men was Richard Plant. He was 22 in 1932. He had moved to Berlin from Frankfurt to study literature, and he spent his first year in the city immersed in its gay world. He went to the bars. He joined the Bund für Menschenrecht. He attended lectures at Hirschfeld's Institute. He met an older man, a schoolteacher named Werner, and fell in love. Plant later wrote about that year. He described it as the most alive he had ever felt. He said it was like discovering that the world had a secret room and he had been given the key. He met poets, artists, men who argued about politics until 4 a.m. in shabby Schöneberg apartments. He discovered that being gay was not a condition to endure in isolation, but an identity to inhabit with others. And then January 1933 happened. Hitler became Chancellor on January 30th, 1933. Not through a violent coup, through a backroom deal. The conservative parties thought they could contain him. They thought they could control him. They appointed him Chancellor as part of a coalition government, assuming he would be their puppet. Within 6 months, he had dismantled the entire constitutional order. But even in January, even on the day he became Chancellor, some men in Berlin thought it might not be that bad. Hitler had promised to restore order, to fix the economy, to make Germany strong again. And Rome was still head of the SA. Rome was gay. Maybe, some men thought, Hitler would leave the gay world alone. They were catastrophically wrong. The crackdown began in February, not against gay men specifically, against everyone the Nazis considered enemies: communists, socialists, Jews, journalists, artists. The Reichstag burned on February 27th. The Nazis blamed the communists, and Hitler used the fire as justification to suspend civil liberties. The Reichstag fire decree gave the police unlimited power to arrest anyone they deemed a threat. No charges, no trial, just arrest and detention. The gay bars were still open, for a few more weeks, but the protection was gone. The police who had tolerated the bars for a decade were either replaced or fell silent. The SPD city government was dissolved. The Nazi Party took over Berlin's administration, and the new police chief was a man named Kurt Daluege, an early Nazi loyalist who saw the bars as targets. On March 3, 1933, the police raided the El Dorado. It was the most visible gay bar in Europe. Shutting it down sent a message. The police arrived with trucks. They arrested everyone inside, 70 men. The next day, the Völkischer Beobachter ran a triumphant headline: "The filth cleaned out." The other bars closed voluntarily rather than wait for raids. Within 2 weeks, nearly every gay bar in Berlin was gone. The owners disappeared. The regulars scattered. The entire infrastructure of the gay world, the bars, the clubs, the social organizations, was dismantled in less than a month. Friedrich Ratschuweit tried to save the Bund für Menschenrecht by rebranding it as a cultural organization, not a political one. He wrote letters to the new government insisting that the organization was patriotic, that its members were loyal Germans, that homosexuality had nothing to do with politics. The letters were ignored. In April, the Nazis dissolved the Bund and confiscated its membership lists. Those lists were a death sentence. The Nazis now had the names and addresses of 48,000 men who had voluntarily identified themselves as homosexual. Some fled. Richard Plant and Werner left Berlin in May. They took a train to France and eventually made it to the United States. Plant spent the rest of his life documenting what happened to the men who stayed. He interviewed survivors, He searched archives, and he wrote a book called The Pink Triangle, one of the first comprehensive accounts of the Nazi persecution of gay men. The men who did not flee went underground, or tried to. But going underground in a police state is nearly impossible when the police have your name on a list. The Gestapo, the Nazi secret police, began making arrests. Not mass arrests, targeted arrests. Men whose names appeared on the Bund membership rolls, men who had been arrested before under paragraph 175 and had police records, men whose neighbours reported them. The arrests followed a pattern. The Gestapo would come to your home or your workplace. They would take you to a police station for questioning. They would ask about your associations, your relationships, your political affiliations. And then they would send you to prison, or to a concentration camp, or sometimes they would release you with a warning and keep you under surveillance. The numbers are hard to pin down. The Nazis did not keep centralized records of arrests under paragraph 175 until later. But historians estimate that between 1933 and 1935, several thousand men were arrested in Berlin alone. Some were given short prison sentences. Some were sent to camps. Some were simply beaten and released. The camps were not yet the extermination camps they would become. In 1933, the camps were detention centers: Dachau, Sachsenhausen, later Buchenwald. They were brutal. Men were worked to exhaustion, beaten by guards and by other prisoners. Gay men were marked with a pink triangle sewn onto their uniforms, and they occupied the lowest position in the camp hierarchy. Even other prisoners despised them. One man who survived the camps was named Heinz Heger. That was not his real name. He wrote under a pseudonym after the war because he was still afraid. Heger was arrested in Vienna in 1939, later than the Berlin arrests, and sent to Sachsenhausen. He described the treatment of gay prisoners in horrifying detail. They were assigned the hardest labor. They were denied medical care. They were sexually assaulted by guards. And they died at higher rates than almost any other category of prisoner except Jews. Heger survived. Barely. He was liberated in 1945, and he said the worst part was not the physical suffering. It was the isolation. Other prisoners formed networks. Communists protected other communists. Political prisoners looked out for each other. But gay men were alone. No one helped them. No one mourned them. And after the war, no one remembered them. But I am getting ahead of the story again. Let me take you back to 1933. Magnus Hirschfeld was not in Berlin when the Nazis came to power. He had left Germany in 1930 on a world lecture tour. He traveled to the United States, to Japan, to China, to Palestine. He gave speeches on sexology. He met with doctors and activists. And he planned to return to Berlin in early 1933. He never made it back. On May 6, 1933, a group of Nazi students stormed the Institute for Sexual Wissenschaft. They were part of a coordinated nationwide action against un-German books. The students broke down the doors. They ransacked the library. They threw 20,000 books and journals into the courtyard. And 4 days later, on May 10th, they burned them. That bonfire on Opernplatz in central Berlin became one of the iconic images of Nazi Germany. Thousands of books burning, students and SA men cheering, Joseph Goebbels giving a speech about purifying German culture, newsreel cameras capturing it all. Most of the books burned that night came from Hirschfeld's Institute, the largest collection of literature on sexuality in the world. Research, case files, photographs, decades of work, gone in a single night. Hirschfeld was in Paris when he heard the news. He watched newsreel footage of his life's work burning and realized he could never go home. He was 65, Jewish, gay, a symbol of everything the Nazis hated. If he returned to Germany, he would be arrested, probably killed. He spent the next 2 years in exile, moving between Paris and Switzerland, trying to rebuild some version of the Institute. He was ill. His health had never been robust, and the stress of exile made it worse. In May 1935, he suffered a heart attack in Nice. He died on his 67th birthday. May 14, 1935. The historian Ralph Doss, who spent years reconstructing Hirschfeld's life, found a letter Hirschfeld wrote in late 1934 to a colleague in Paris. In it, Hirschfeld said he did not regret the work. He regretted only that it had not been completed. He believed that scientific understanding of sexuality would eventually triumph over prejudice. He believed the arc of history was on his side. He was right, but not in his lifetime, and not in the lifetime of the men he tried to protect. By the end of 1933, the gay world that had existed in Berlin for 15 years was gone. The bars were closed. The organizations were dissolved. The magazines stopped publishing. The institute was a burned-out shell, and thousands of men were either in hiding, in prison, or already dead. The question historians ask is, why was the destruction so fast and so total? Part of the answer is that the Nazis were efficient. They had lists, they had infrastructure, they had a totalitarian system that allowed them to move quickly against any group they designated as enemies. But another part of the answer is that the gay world had been visible. It had been open, it had been organized. And all of that visibility, all of that openness, all of that organization meant the Nazis knew exactly where to find it. The bars had addresses, the organizations had membership rolls, the magazines had subscriber lists. The men who had been most visible, most active, most public were the easiest to arrest. Visibility had been their strength. It became their vulnerability. That is the tragedy of Weimar Berlin. The gay world that flourished there was more open, more organized, more politically active than anything that had existed before. And that openness made it possible for the Nazis to destroy it in a matter of months. There is a plaque now on Nollendorfplatz. It was installed in 1989. It says, "Beaten to death, silenced to death," memorializing the homosexual victims of National Socialism. Thousands of Berliners walk past it every day. Most do not stop to read it, but some do. And some of them learn that there was a time, not so long ago, when Berlin was the one city in the world where gay men could live openly. And some of them learn what happened when that city fell. Now let me tell you about the men who tried to resist. Not everyone disappeared. Not everyone went quietly. Some men, even after the bars closed and the arrests began, tried to keep the community alive underground. One of those men was Karl Gieser. He had been Hirschfeld's partner for more than 20 years. He had worked at the institute. He had helped manage its operations. And when the institute was destroyed, Gysi tried to salvage what he could. He smuggled documents out of the building before the Nazis could confiscate everything. He hid photographs. He preserved case files. He carried them with him when he fled to France. Gieser lived in exile in Paris, working with other German refugees, trying to keep some version of the gay rights movement alive from abroad. But the work was impossible. There was no money, no infrastructure, no safe way to communicate with people still in Germany, and the psychological toll of exile was crushing. In 1938, as the Nazi regime expanded and France seemed increasingly unsafe, Gysi faced the prospect of being deported back to Germany. He could not endure it. On January 7, 1938, he took his own life. He was 51. He left behind a note saying he could not go on watching everything they had built be destroyed. The documents he had saved were lost. Some survived in scattered archives, but most disappeared. Another man who resisted was named Herbert Schmid. He had been a regular at the Mikado. After the bar closed, he tried to organize private gatherings, small groups, 5 or 6 men meeting in someone's apartment to talk, to maintain some sense of connection. It was dangerous. The Gestapo had informants everywhere. Anyone in your apartment could report you. Schmid was arrested in 1936. He spent 3 years in prison. He was released in 1939, just before the war started, with a warning that if he was arrested again, he would be sent to a camp. He survived the war by staying invisible. He never spoke publicly about his experiences until the 1970s, when he was interviewed for an oral history project. He said the hardest part was not the fear, it was the loneliness. He said that after 1933, it felt like the entire gay world had been erased from existence. The bars were gone. The organizations were gone. The friends he had made disappeared, arrested, or fled, or silenced. And the silence was so complete that he sometimes wondered if it had all been a dream. But it had not been a dream. And the evidence that it was real survived in fragments. Photographs. A few. Mostly from private collections. Men at parties, men in bars, couples, groups. Some of the faces are smiling, some are serious, some look directly at the camera with an expression that is hard to read. Defiance, maybe, or just presence. There are membership cards from the Bund für Menschenrecht, fragile pieces of paper with names and dates and signatures. Proof that these organizations existed, that these men existed. There are issues of the magazines. Die Freundschaft, Der eigene, Die Insel, preserved in archives in Amsterdam, in New York, in private collections. Some pages are brittle, some are water damaged, but they survived. And there are letters, love letters mostly. Men writing to each other in code, careful language, knowing the letters might be intercepted but unable to stop writing. One letter, preserved in the Schwules Museum in Berlin, was written in 1934 by a man named Ernst to someone named Peter. It is short. I think of you every evening. I hope you are safe. Please burn this after you read it. The letter was not burned. Somehow it survived. These fragments are all we have. There are no comprehensive records. The Nazis destroyed the membership lists. They burned the books. They shut down the magazines. And the men themselves, the ones who survived, mostly stayed silent after the war. They were still afraid. Paragraph 175 remained law in West Germany until 1969. In East Germany until 1968. Men who had been arrested by the Nazis were arrested again by the post-war German state. Their sentences were upheld, and the wider world did not care. When Holocaust memorials were built, gay victims were not included. When reparations were paid to survivors, gay men were excluded. The pink triangle was not recognized as a symbol of Nazi persecution until the 1970s, when gay activists reclaimed it. The silence lasted decades, but some men eventually spoke. Richard Plant, who had fled in 1933, returned to Germany in the 1980s to research his book. He tracked down survivors. He interviewed them. He asked them to tell their stories. And slowly, painfully, some of them did. One survivor, a man named Albrecht Becker, was arrested in 1935 at age 19. He was sent to a camp. He survived, and after the war, he became an artist. He never hid his past, but he did not speak about it publicly until the 1990s. When asked why he waited so long, he said, "No one wanted to hear it. People told me I deserved what happened, so I stayed quiet." But eventually, he stopped staying quiet. In 1995, he appeared in a documentary about gay Holocaust survivors. He was 79 years old. He spoke calmly, without drama, about what he had witnessed. And he said something that stayed with everyone who heard it. He said, "We were not the only victims. We were not even the largest group of victims. But we were the ones no one defended. And we were the ones no one mourned." And that silence continued long after the camps were liberated. That silence is why this story matters. Because Berlin, from 1919 to 1933, was proof that another world was possible. It was not perfect. It was fragile. It was always under threat. But for 15 years, in one city, gay men lived openly. They built community. They organized politically. They published. They celebrated. They loved each other without hiding. And then it was taken away. The speed of the destruction is what haunts historians. 15 years to build, 6 months to destroy. But let me take you back one more time to when it was still standing. Because the story of Berlin's gay world is not just about its destruction. It is about what existed, what men built, what they felt when they walked into those bars for the first time and realized they were not alone. The year is 1927. You are 24. You have just moved to Berlin from a small town in Bavaria where everyone knew everyone, and you spent your entire adolescence pretending to be someone you were not. You have a job now at a printing company in Kreuzberg. You rent a room in a boarding house near Hallisches Tor, and someone at work, a man, who's been friendly in a way that made you wonder, slips you a piece of paper with an address on it. The address is on Motzstrasse. The paper says nothing else. Just the address and a time. 10 o'clock. You spend the entire day nervous. You tell yourself you will not go. You tell yourself it is too dangerous. But at 9:30, you put on your coat and walk. Motzstrasse is not far. 15 minutes from your room. The street is quiet. Residential buildings. A few shops. Nothing that looks like a bar. You walk past the address twice before you notice the door. Unmarked. Just a number. You stand outside for 5 minutes trying to decide. Then someone else approaches. An older man, well-dressed. He nods at you, opens the door, and walks down a flight of stairs. You follow. The room at the bottom is warm. Dim lighting. A bar along one wall. Tables scattered across the floor. And men. Maybe 40 of them. Talking, laughing. Some sitting close together. Some dancing in a small cleared space near the back. No one looks at you like you are strange for being there. No one looks at you with suspicion. The bartender nods. Someone offers to buy you a drink. You sit at a table in the corner and just watch. This is the Kleist Casino. This is the place you will come back to every Saturday for the next 6 years. This is where you will meet the first man you will love. This is where you will stop feeling like an exile from your own life. That feeling, the feeling of coming home to a place you did not know existed, was the same for thousands of men. Berlin gave them that. Not safety, not equality, but a room where they could breathe. And the men who ran these spaces understood what they were providing. They were not just bar owners. They were community architects. Otto, who ran the Mikado, kept a small library behind the bar. Magazines. Books. If you were new to the city and did not know where else to go, Otto would lend you a copy of Adolf Brand's address book, which listed every gay-friendly establishment in Berlin. He would tell you which bars were safe and which were tourist traps. He would warn you about the blackmailers who worked the Tiergarten. He would give you the phone number of a lawyer if you got arrested. Otto was not an activist in the formal sense. He never joined the Bund für Menschenrecht. He never testified before the Reichstag. But he kept men alive. He kept them connected. And when the Nazis came, Otto disappeared. No one knows what happened to him. His name does not appear in any arrest records. He may have fled. He may have died. Or he may have simply closed the bar and gone back to being invisible. Another man who shaped the community was named Bruno Bals. He was a songwriter, one of the most successful in Germany during the Weimar years. He wrote lyrics for hit songs performed in cabarets and on the radio. He was openly gay within Berlin's arts scene, though he was careful in public, and he used his position to quietly support other gay men. Bals employed gay musicians. He introduced men to each other. He hosted parties at his apartment in Charlottenburg, where artists, writers, and activists mixed. And he used his earnings to fund gay publications. He was one of the anonymous donors who kept Die Freundschaft running when subscriptions were not enough to cover costs. In 1933, Bals was arrested. The Gestapo held him for weeks. They beat him. They demanded the names of other gay men in Berlin's art scene. He gave them nothing. He was eventually released, historians still are not sure why, and he survived the entire Nazi period by staying silent and writing propaganda songs. After the war, he never spoke publicly about his sexuality again. But his songs from the Weimar years became standards. Some are still performed today, and most people who hear them have no idea they were written by a gay man who survived the camps. The care networks that men like Otto and Bals built were fragile. They depended on individual courage, on personal relationships, on money quietly passed from hand to hand. There was no institutional safety net. If you were arrested, you were alone. If you lost your job, there was no gay community center to help you find another. If your family disowned you, you survived on the generosity of friends, or you did not survive. But those informal networks were real, and they saved lives. One story that captures this comes from a man named Felix Haller. He was a doctor, not a famous one. He ran a small practice in Schöneberg, and he quietly treated gay men who came to him with injuries from beatings, from blackmail attempts gone wrong, from suicide attempts. He did not report them to the police. He did not judge them. He simply treated them and sent them home. After 1933, Halle continued seeing patients in secret. He treated men who had been released from camps and needed medical care but could not go to a hospital because their camp records would identify them. He forged medical documents to help men avoid conscription into the Wehrmacht, and he hid at least 3 men in his apartment at different points during the war. Halle survived. He died in 1952. And no one knew about what he had done until his partner, a man named Ernst, told the story in an oral history interview in the 1980s. These small acts of resistance and care are easy to overlook in the larger narrative of Nazi persecution. But they mattered. They kept people alive, and they preserved some thread of connection even after the visible community was destroyed. Now, let me tell you about the last time the bars tried to reopen. It was 1945, May. The war was over. The Soviet army had taken Berlin. The city was rubble. Hundreds of thousands of dead. Buildings collapsed. Infrastructure destroyed. And in the chaos, some men thought maybe, just maybe, they could rebuild what had been taken. A few gay bars opened in the summer of 1945. Small, hidden, mostly in the western sectors, which were under American and British control. The Soviet sector was more repressive, but in the West, for a few months, there was a kind of anarchic freedom. The old Nazi laws were still technically on the books, but no one was enforcing anything. The occupation authorities were focused on feeding the population and clearing rubble. They did not care about gay bars. One of those bars was in a basement on Fuggerstrasse, near where the El Dorado had been. It had no name. Everyone just called it the Fuggerstrasse Bar. It opened in July 1945. The owner was a man who had survived the camps. He never gave his name to anyone. He ran the bar for 6 months. Richard Plant, researching his book decades later, found a letter from a man who had been there. The man described it as surreal. The bar had no electricity, candles, no real liquor, just homemade schnapps that tasted like kerosene. And the men who came were skeletal, traumatized. Some still wearing fragments of camp uniforms because they had nothing else. They sat in near silence. Occasionally someone would cry. But they came because they needed to be in a room with other gay men. They needed to know they had survived. The bar closed in early 1946. The British occupation authorities shut it down. Paragraph 175 was still law. The British military government decided to enforce it, and just like that, the brief window closed. It would be another 23 years before gay bars could operate openly again in Germany. 23 years. But some men kept the memory alive. They told stories. They saved photographs. They preserved letters. And eventually, in the 1970s, when the modern gay rights movement was gaining strength, They shared what they remembered. One of the most important preservation efforts was led by a man named Manfred Herzer. He was not old enough to have experienced Weimar Berlin firsthand. He was born in 1948. But he became obsessed with recovering that history. In the 1970s, he began tracking down survivors. He recorded their testimonies. He searched archives in East and West Berlin. He collected photographs, membership cards, magazine issues, anything that proved the community had existed. Herzer eventually became one of the founders of the Schwules Museum, the Gay Museum in Berlin. It opened in 1985 in a small apartment in Kreuzberg. The museum's first exhibit was about Weimar Berlin, and it included material no one had seen in 50 years. Photographs of men in bars, membership cards from the Bund für Menschenrecht, issues of Der Eigene, letters. People who visited the exhibit said it felt like looking at a lost civilization, because that is what it was, a world that had existed and been deliberately erased. The historian Florence Tamain, who wrote the most comprehensive study of European homosexuality in the interwar period, spent years piecing together what Berlin's gay world actually looked like. She found police reports, court records, newspaper archives, personal letters, diaries, and she found something that surprised her. The volume of documentation was enormous. For all the Nazis' efforts to erase this history, they had not entirely succeeded. Fragments survived, and from those fragments, you could reconstruct a world. Taman writes that what made Berlin unique was not just the size of its gay community, but the fact that the community was politically conscious. The men in Berlin did not just want to be left alone. They wanted legal recognition. They wanted rights. They organized. They lobbied. They published manifestos. They argued in public that their existence was legitimate and their love was valuable. That political consciousness is what separates Weimar Berlin from every underground gay world that came before it. This was not just survival. This was a demand for justice, and that demand echoes forward. Because the activists who fought for gay rights in the 1970s and 1980s and 1990s were fighting the same fight. They were making the same argument. They were demanding the same recognition. And some of them knew they were continuing a struggle that had been interrupted in 1933. When the pink triangle was reclaimed as a symbol of gay pride in the 1970s, it was a deliberate act of memory. It said, "We were destroyed once. We will not let that happen again." And when memorials to gay Holocaust victims were finally built, in Berlin, in Amsterdam, in San Francisco, they said, "We were here, we suffered, and we refuse to be forgotten." But those memorials took decades to build. The first one was not erected until 1987. That is 54 years after the community was destroyed. 54 years of silence. Why so long? Part of the answer is that post-war Germany did not want to remember. Both East and West Germany kept paragraph 175 on the books. Both continued to arrest gay men. The Nazi-era convictions were upheld. Men who had been sent to camps by the Nazis were re-imprisoned by democratic governments. And those men learned to stay silent. But another part of the answer is that the broader gay rights movement initially did not prioritize historical memory. In the 1970s, activists were focused on the present, on getting laws changed, on stopping police harassment, on fighting for survival in the midst of the AIDS crisis. Looking backward felt less urgent than fighting forward. It was only in the 1980s and 1990s, as the generation that had lived through the war began to die, that activists realized, if we do not collect these stories now, they will be lost forever. And so they collected them. They interviewed survivors. They recorded testimonies. They built archives. They created museums. And they made sure that the world that had existed in Berlin from 1919 to 1933 would not be forgotten. That work continues today. The Schwules Museum is still open. It has moved to a larger space. It has expanded its collection, and it remains one of the only museums in the world dedicated entirely to LGBTQ history. When you visit the museum, you can see the original membership card of Friedrich Radsuveit, the man who founded the Bund für Menschenrecht. You can see photographs of the Eldorado. You can see issues of Die Freundschaft. You can see letters. You can see the fragments, and you can imagine what it was like to walk down Mottstrasse in 1927, to open an unmarked door, to descend a flight of stairs, and to find yourself in a room full of men who had been waiting for you without knowing you existed. That feeling, the feeling of being found, is what Berlin gave to thousands of men, and it is what was taken away. Now let me tell you about one more person, because the story of Berlin's gay world is not complete without her. Her name was Lotte Harm, the performer I mentioned earlier, but let me tell you more about what she meant to the community. Lotte performed at the Silhouette 3 nights a week. She wore a tailored tuxedo, top hat, her hair slicked back. She sang in a low, warm voice that filled the small room. And she sang songs that were coded but not subtle. Songs about women who loved women. Songs about living outside the lines society drew. Songs about surviving. One of her most popular songs was called Das Lila Lied, the Lavender Song. It was written in 1920 by a composer named Misha Spoliansky, with lyrics by Kurt Schwabach. The song was explicitly about homosexual rights. The lyrics said, "We are different from the others, who are dull and ordinary in their ways. We love lilac nights, we love lavender days." It was performed in cabarets across Berlin, and it became an anthem. Lotte sang it at the Silhouette, and when she did, the entire room stood. Every time, men and women, they stood and sang along, because the song said out loud what they were all feeling. We are here, we exist, and we are not ashamed. After 1933, Das Lila Lied was banned. Performing it was enough to get you arrested. The sheet music was destroyed, and for decades, historians thought the song was lost. Then in 1982, a musicologist named Michael Pollack found a recording in a private collection in Paris. Someone had made a recording of Lotte singing the song in 1927. The quality was poor, scratchy, but the voice was clear. Pollack restored the recording and released it. And when gay activists in Germany heard it, they wept, because here was proof that the community had existed, proof that they had sung, proof that they had been proud. Lotte Harm was arrested in 1933. She was sent to Ravensbrück, a camp for women. She survived. She was liberated in 1945, and she never performed again. She lived quietly in West Berlin until her death in 1976. She never spoke publicly about her past. She never gave interviews. She simply survived, but her recording survived. And now, when commemorations are held for the gay victims of the Holocaust, Das Lila Lied is performed. It has been recorded by modern artists. It has been sung at memorials in Berlin, in Amsterdam, in New York, and it connects the present to the past. The song reminds us that Berlin's gay world was not just bars and organizations and political campaigns. It was also art, music, literature, performance. It was culture being created by people who knew they were building something new. One of the most prolific artists in that world was a man named John Henry Mackay. He was a writer, born in Scotland but raised in Germany, and he spent decades writing novels and poetry about male love. His work was explicit. He did not hide behind metaphor. He wrote about desire, about relationships between men, about the pain of living in a society that condemned what you felt. Mackay wrote under his own name and under the pseudonym Sagitta. The Sagitta books were more daring. They included stories about relationships between older men and adolescent boys, which was legal in some German states at the time, but socially explosive. And Mackay argued that these relationships, when consensual, were not exploitation, but a form of Greek-style mentorship. That argument is uncomfortable now. It was controversial then. Even within Berlin's gay community, Mackay's work was divisive. Some saw him as a brave truth-teller. Others saw him as a liability. someone whose writings gave ammunition to people who wanted to keep paragraph 175 in place. But Mackay kept writing. He published at his own expense when no commercial publisher would touch his work. He distributed his books through underground networks. And he found readers, men who wrote to him saying his work had saved their lives, saying that reading his books was the first time they realized they were not alone. Mackay died in 1933, just months after Hitler came to power. He was 76. He had lived long enough to see Berlin become a city where gay men could live openly. And he lived just long enough to see it begin to collapse. His books were among those burned on open plats. Every copy the Nazis could find was destroyed, and for decades his work was forgotten. It was only in the 1970s that gay historians began to recover and republish his writings. And even now, his work remains controversial, because he wrote about things that are still difficult to discuss, about desire that crossed age boundaries, about relationships that existed in legal grey zones. But Mackay's work is part of the historical record, and ignoring it does not serve anyone. Because the truth is that Berlin's gay world in the 1920s was complicated. It was not a utopia. It was not morally simple. It was a real community of real people navigating survival in a society that was hostile to their existence. And they did not always make choices that translate cleanly into modern ethical frameworks. The historian Ralph Doce, who studied Mackay's life, writes that one of the hardest tasks for historians of this period is resisting the urge to simplify, to make Berlin's gay world either purely heroic or purely tragic, to erase the parts that are uncomfortable, to turn real, flawed human beings into symbols. Doce argues that the men in Berlin deserve to be remembered as they were: complicated, brave, fearful, creative, sometimes radical, sometimes conservative, sometimes in conflict with each other, but always human. That complexity shows up in the political debates within the community. Because Berlin's gay rights movement was not unified. There were deep disagreements about strategy, about goals, about who the movement was for. Magnus Hirschfeld believed in scientific respectability. He wanted to convince doctors and lawmakers that homosexuality was a natural variation that deserved legal protection. He wanted to work within the system. Adolf Brand believed in cultural celebration. He wanted to revive the Greek ideal of male love. He wanted gay men to see themselves as part of a proud tradition stretching back to antiquity. He thought Hirschfeld's medical framework was pathologizing. Kurt Hiller believed in political confrontation. He wanted gay men to demand equality loudly. He thought respectability was a trap. And Friedrich Radschuvite believed in mass organization. He wanted to build a movement so large it could not be ignored. He focused on membership numbers and political lobbying. These men respected each other. But they also argued, constantly, in their magazines, at conferences, in private letters. They disagreed about whether to work with the SPD or remain independent. They disagreed about whether to include lesbians as equal partners or focus on male-specific issues. They disagreed about whether the goal was tolerance or pride, and none of them saw what was coming. None of them imagined that the entire debate would become irrelevant in a matter of months, that blindness is not unique to them. It is a feature of living through history. You cannot see the rupture until it is already upon you. And even when the warning signs are visible, it is hard to believe that the world you know could simply end. There were warning signs: the Nazi Party's rhetoric, the street violence, the attacks on Hirschfeld, the 1930 election results, the economic collapse. All of it pointed toward disaster. But many men in Berlin convinced themselves it would not be as bad as it seemed, that the crisis would pass, that the Weimar Republic, flawed as it was, would survive. Christopher Isherwood wrote about this later. He said that in 1932, he and his friends in Berlin spent their evenings debating politics and their nights dancing in bars, and they somehow believed both could continue indefinitely. They saw the SA marching in the streets. They read the Nazi newspapers, but they could not quite believe that the entire world they inhabited would be swept away. And then it was. The speed still shocks. 6 months. From Hitler's appointment as Chancellor in January 1933 to the complete destruction of Berlin's gay world by July, 6 months to dismantle what had taken 15 years to build. Part of the reason the destruction was so total is that the Nazis understood how the gay world was organized. They knew about the bars, they knew about the organizations, they knew about the magazines, and they knew that visibility was both the community's strength and its vulnerability. The Nazis also understood that gay men were politically isolated. Unlike Jews, who had international support networks and some degree of political organization, gay men had no allies. The churches condemned them. The communists considered homosexuality a bourgeois decadence. The Social Democrats were sympathetic, but not willing to defend gay rights when the entire republic was collapsing. Gay men were alone, and so the Nazis faced no resistance when they shut down the bars. No one protested. No one complained to the international press. No one cared. That isolation continued through the entire Nazi period, and it continued after the war. When survivors of the camps were liberated, gay men were not recognized as victims of Nazi persecution. They received no reparations. Their camp sentences were often upheld by post-war courts, and they were told to stay silent. One survivor, a man named Pierre Seal, was arrested in France in 1941 and sent to a camp. He was tortured. He watched his lover torn apart by dogs in front of the assembled prisoners as a warning. He survived, and he did not speak about what happened to him until 1982. 41 years of silence, because he knew that if he spoke, he would be arrested again. Homosexuality was still illegal in France until 1982. Seal eventually wrote a memoir. It was published in 1994, and it is one of the most harrowing accounts of the Nazi persecution of gay men. He describes the violence, the isolation, the way gay prisoners were treated worse than other prisoners, despised even by fellow victims, and he describes the post-war silence, the way no one wanted to hear his story, the way he was told he should be ashamed. The historian Regis Schlagdenhaufen documented Seal's case and dozens of others. He found that in France alone, hundreds of gay men were arrested during the Nazi occupation and sent to camps. Most did not survive, and those who did were forgotten. Schlagdenhaufen writes that one of the reasons gay Holocaust victims remained invisible for so long is that their persecution did not fit the standard narrative of the Holocaust. The Holocaust is remembered primarily as the genocide of Jews, which it was. 6 million Jews were murdered, but the Holocaust also targeted other groups: Roma, disabled people, political prisoners, Jehovah's Witnesses, and gay men. Somewhere between 5,000 and 15,000 gay men were sent to Nazi concentration camps. The exact number is unknown because many records were destroyed and many arrests were not centrally documented. Of those sent to camps, more than half died. The death rate for gay prisoners was one of the highest of any category, because they were assigned the hardest labor, because they were denied medical care, because other prisoners and guards alike brutalized them, and because no one protected them. The pink triangle marked them, and it marked them after the war as well. Because being identified as a gay camp survivor meant admitting to a crime, and so most survivors never came forward. The few who did speak found no audience. No one wanted to hear it. Germany was focused on rebuilding. The Cold War was beginning, and gay men were still considered criminals. It was not until the 1970s, when a new generation of gay activists began demanding recognition, that the silence started to break. In 1972, a group of activists in Frankfurt organized a protest at the site of the former Ravensbrück concentration camp. They laid wreaths in memory of the gay victims. The camp authorities tried to remove the wreaths. They said gay prisoners were not legitimate victims of Nazi persecution. The activists refused to leave. The confrontation was filmed and broadcast on German television. That protest marked a turning point. It forced Germany to begin confronting a history it had tried to ignore, and it connected the post-war gay rights movement to the pre-Nazi world that had been destroyed. The activists in Frankfurt knew about Weimar Berlin. They had read about Magnus Hirschfeld. They had seen photographs of the bars, and they understood that they were not starting from scratch. They were continuing a struggle that had been interrupted. That sense of continuity became central to the gay rights movement in Germany. When activists fought to repeal paragraph 175 in the 1960s, they explicitly invoked the Weimar-era campaign. When they organized, they modeled their organizations on the Bund für Menschenrecht. When they published magazines, they named them in honor of the Weimar-era journals that had been destroyed. They were rebuilding what had been taken, and they succeeded. In 1969, West Germany finally reformed paragraph 175, decriminalizing homosexual acts between men over the age of 21. In 1973, the age of consent was equalized. In 1994, after reunification, paragraph 175 was fully repealed. It took 61 years. But the law that had been used to destroy Berlin's gay world was finally gone. The survivors who lived to see the repeal were few. Most had died. But those who remained felt a sense of vindication. The law that had criminalized their love was gone. The state had finally acknowledged that it had been wrong. But even that acknowledgement was incomplete, because Germany did not officially apologize to gay Holocaust victims until 2002, and it did not offer reparations until 2017, 72 years after the camps were liberated. By then, almost all the survivors were dead. Richard Plant, who had fled Berlin in 1933 and spent his life documenting what happened, died in 1998. He was 88. He had lived long enough to see Germany begin to confront its past. But he did not live long enough to see the reparations. He did not live long enough to see gay marriage legalized in Germany. He did not live long enough to see the memorials that now stand in Berlin. But his work survived. His book, The Pink Triangle, remains the most comprehensive account of the Nazi persecution of gay men, and it ensured that the story could not be forgotten. Another historian who devoted his life to recovering this history was Klaus Müller. He was born in post-war Germany and became obsessed with understanding what had happened to gay men under the Nazis. In the 1990s, he worked with the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum to create the first major exhibit on gay victims of the Holocaust. The exhibit opened in 2000 and traveled to multiple cities. Müller collected testimonies. He tracked down surviving photographs. He found documents in archives across Europe. And he made the case that gay victims deserve to be remembered alongside other Holocaust victims. The work was controversial. Some Holocaust survivors objected. They felt that including gay victims diminished the suffering of Jews. They argued that the Holocaust was specifically a genocide of Jews and that expanding the definition diluted its meaning. Müller's response was careful. He said that recognizing gay victims did not diminish Jewish suffering. It simply acknowledged a more complete truth, that the Nazis targeted multiple groups, that some people were targeted for more than one reason, that a Jewish gay man faced double persecution, and that all victims deserved recognition. That argument eventually prevailed. And now, when you visit Holocaust memorials, you see pink triangles alongside yellow stars. But it took decades, and it required activists and historians to fight for that recognition every step of the way. One of the most moving memorials is in Berlin, near the Tiergarten. It was dedicated in 2008. It is a simple concrete block with a small window. When you look through the window, you see a video loop of two men kissing. Just kissing. Nothing more. But the act of placing that image in a public memorial in the city where gay men were once arrested for far less is extraordinary. The memorial has been vandalized multiple times. The window has been smashed. The video screen has been destroyed. And each time it has been repaired, because the people who fought for that memorial understand that visibility is still contested, that remembering is still political, that the fight is not over. Berlin today has one of the largest gay communities in Europe. The neighborhood around Nollendorfplatz is once again a gay center. The bars have returned, the organizations have returned, and the city celebrates its history. But that history is complicated, because the Berlin that exists today is not the same Berlin that existed in the 1920s. The buildings are different, the streets have been rebuilt, the people are different, and the world is different. Paragraph 175 is gone. Gay marriage is legal in Germany. Discrimination based on sexual orientation is illegal. The legal framework is unrecognizable from what existed in 1933. But other things remain the same. Queer people are still targeted by far-right movements. Hate crimes still happen. And in other parts of the world, gay men still live under laws that criminalize their existence. More than 60 countries still have sodomy laws. In some, the penalty is death. And so the story of Berlin from 1919 to 1933 is not just history. It is a warning about how quickly rights can be taken away, about how fragile visibility is, about how important it is to remember. The lesson of Berlin is not a simple one, and anyone who tries to reduce it to a single moral is missing the complexity of what happened. Some historians say the lesson is, visibility is dangerous. That Berlin's gay community was destroyed precisely because it had been so open. That by organizing, by publishing, by making themselves visible, gay men created the infrastructure the Nazis used to hunt them down. And there is truth in that. The membership lists, the bar addresses, the magazine subscriptions. All of that visibility became a map for persecution. But other historians say the opposite. They say the lesson is, invisibility is death. That the men who survived the Nazi period were the ones who had connections, who had community, who had learned from the visible years how to recognize and trust each other. That the networks built in the 1920s, even after they were forced underground, saved lives. And there is truth in that too. The real lesson, if there is one, is that there are no safe choices under tyranny. Visibility can be dangerous. Invisibility can be fatal. Community can be a trap. Isolation can be lethal. There is no formula for survival when the state decides you should not exist. But what Berlin proved during those 15 years is that another way of living is possible, that gay men can build institutions, that they can organize politically, that they can create culture, that they can love openly, that they can live without shame, and that when they do, something beautiful emerges. Not perfect, not safe, but beautiful. The photographs that survive from that era show ordinary moments. Men at a cafe, a couple sitting close on a park bench, a group at a birthday party, someone laughing at a joke the camera did not capture. These are not dramatic images. They are domestic, quiet, human. And that ordinariness is what makes them powerful. Because what the Nazis tried to erase was not just gay people. It was the idea that gay people could live ordinary lives, that they could have friends, celebrate birthdays, grow old, be boring. The Nazis wanted the world to believe that gay men were either predators or degenerates, incapable of love, incapable of building anything lasting. The photographs prove otherwise. They show men who loved, who built community, who survived, who were happy, at least sometimes, in a world that told them happiness was not meant for them. One photograph in particular has become iconic. It is from 1929. It shows a group of about 20 men standing outside a bar in Schöneberg. They are all dressed well, suits, hats. A few are smiling at the camera, a few look serious. And in the center, Two men are standing close enough that their shoulders touch. They are looking at each other, not at the camera, and the expression on their faces is gentle, familiar. The look of two people who know each other deeply. No one knows their names. The photograph was found in an archive in Amsterdam decades after the war. It had been smuggled out of Germany by someone who fled in 1933. And it survived because someone believed it mattered. That photograph now hangs in the Schwules Museum, and visitors stand in front of it for a long time. Because it captures something essential. It captures the fact that these men existed, that they had faces, names, even if we do not know them now, lives, loves, futures that were stolen. Another image that survived is a page from a 1928 issue of Die Freundschaft. It is an advice column. A reader has written in asking how to meet other gay men in a small town where there are no bars. The columnist responds with kindness. He says, "You are not alone. Even in small towns, there are others. Look for quiet signals, a certain way of dressing, a lingering glance, a coded phrase. And when you find someone, be careful, but do not be afraid to speak." That advice column is a small thing, one page in one magazine, but it is evidence of something larger, evidence that the gay world in Berlin was not just about bars and nightlife. It was about men helping each other survive. It was about passing on knowledge. It was about building networks that reached beyond the city, into the provinces, into villages, into places where isolation was total. And those networks mattered. Because when the crackdown came, the men who survived were often the ones who knew how to read those signals, who knew how to find each other even when the bars were gone, who knew how to trust carefully and how to stay silent when necessary. One survivor, a man named Walter Schwarzer, described how he survived the Nazi years. He said he had learned in the 1920s how to recognize other gay men, a way of standing, a tone of voice, a slight emphasis on a particular word. And during the Nazi period, he used those signals to quietly connect with a small circle of men. They met in private apartments, never more than 3 or 4 at a time. They never talked about the past. They never mentioned the bars. They simply sat together, drank tea, played cards, and survived. Schwarzer said those quiet evenings kept him sane, that knowing there were 3 other men in Berlin who knew what he was and did not judge him was the difference between surviving and not surviving. He lived until 1989. He was there when the Berlin Wall fell. He was there when Germany began to reunify. And he was there when the first memorial to gay Holocaust victims was proposed. He testified in support of it. And he said something in his testimony that stayed with everyone who heard it. He said, "I am not asking you to pity us. I am asking you to remember that we were here, that we built something, and that it mattered." That request, "Remember that we were here," is at the heart of why this history is important. Because for most of history, gay people have been erased, not just killed, erased. Their names removed from records, their relationships described as friendships, their love ignored or rewritten. And that erasure is a kind of second death. It means they died twice, once in body, once in memory. The fight to recover the history of Berlin's gay world is a fight against that erasure. It is a fight to say, these people lived, they loved, they built something, and they deserve to be remembered. That fight has been won, partially. The memorials exist, the museums exist, the scholarship exists. You can now walk through Berlin and see plaques marking where the bars were. You can visit the site of Magnus Hirschfeld's institute. You can stand in Nollendorfplatz and know what happened there. But memory is fragile. It requires maintenance. It requires people who care enough to preserve it. And as the generation that remembered the Weimar years dies, the work of preservation becomes more urgent. Because the story of Berlin is not just about the past, it is about the future. Every time a government passes a law targeting queer people, the ghost of Berlin is there. Every time someone says that LGBTQ+ visibility has gone too far, that pride parades are too provocative, that queer people should be quieter, more respectful, less demanding, the ghost of Berlin is there. Because that is how it started, with calls for decency, with claims that gay people were too visible, with the argument that they were corrupting youth, undermining society, weakening the nation. And then the bars were closed, and then the arrests began, and then the camps opened, and then thousands of people died. That progression, from rhetoric to persecution to extermination, is not unique to Germany. It has happened in other places. It is happening in other places now. And the only defense against it is memory. Memory that says, we have seen this before. We know where it leads, and we will not let it happen again. That is why the story of Berlin matters. Not because it offers easy lessons, not because it provides a roadmap for how to fight oppression, but because it is a record of what was lost. And loss, when remembered, becomes a kind of resistance. The men who lived in Berlin from 1919 to 1933 did not think of themselves as heroes. They were simply trying to live, to find love, to build community, to survive in a world that was hostile to their existence. They made mistakes. They disagreed with each other. They were flawed and human and complicated. But they were also brave. Because living openly, even when the law says you should not exist, is an act of courage, and they deserve to be remembered for that courage. Magnus Hirschfeld died believing his work had failed. He died in exile. He died watching his life's work burn. He died knowing that the institute he had built was destroyed, and the community he had tried to protect was being hunted. But he was wrong. His work did not fail. It was interrupted, but it was not destroyed. Because the ideas he fought for, that gay people are fully human, that they deserve rights, that their love is legitimate, those ideas survived. They survived in the memories of the men who fled. They survived in the fragments that were preserved. They survived in the scholars who recovered the history. And they survived in the modern gay rights movement that built on the foundation he laid. Hirschfeld did not live to see gay marriage legalized. He did not live to see paragraph 175 repealed. He did not live to see the memorials. But his work made all of that possible, because he was one of the first people to argue publicly that gay people deserved equality. And that argument, once spoken, cannot be unspoken. It echoes forward through time. It reaches people he never met. It changes the world in ways he never saw. That is what all movements for justice do. They plant seeds, and those seeds grow long after the planters are gone. The men and women who built Berlin's gay world in the 1920s planted seeds. They showed that it was possible to live openly. They showed that community could be built. They showed that political organizing could work. And even though their world was destroyed, the seeds survived. When gay activists in the 1970s began organizing again, they were watering seeds planted 50 years earlier. When the first pride parades were held, they were harvesting what had been sown in Berlin. When gay marriage became legal, it was the fruit of work that began with men like Hirschfeld and Radsuvite and Hiller. And when queer people today walk down the street holding their partner's hand, they are walking on ground that was broken in Berlin. They are living the future that those men fought for and did not get to see. That continuity, from past struggle to present freedom, is what makes history worth remembering. Because it reminds us that progress is possible, that rights can be won, that the world can change. But it also reminds us that nothing is permanent, that rights can be taken away as quickly as they were won, that vigilance is required, that memory is a form of protection. Berlin's gay world lasted 15 years. That is not long, a decade and a half, the length of a childhood. the span of a single generation's youth. And yet, in that brief window, something extraordinary was built. A city where gay men could live openly, where they could organize, where they could publish, where they could love without hiding. And then it was gone. Not because of apathy, not because of neglect, but because of deliberate, systematic violence. Because a fascist movement decided that gay people were enemies of the state, and because most of the world did not care enough to stop it. That is the haunting part. Not just that it happened, but that it happened in full view of the world. The Nazis did not hide what they were doing. They announced it. They celebrated it. They published the addresses of the bars they shut down. They held public book burnings. They paraded prisoners through the streets. And the international community did nothing. When Holocaust survivors were liberated in 1945, the world said, never again. And that promise was kept partially for Jewish survivors. Memorials were built, reparations were paid, education was mandated. But for gay survivors, the promise was broken. They were told to stay silent. They were told they were not real victims. They were told they should be ashamed. And so they were forgotten for decades. It is only now, 80 years after the camps were liberated, that the full story is being told, that the memorials are being built, that the names are being recovered, that the history is being taught. And even now, the work is incomplete. There are still countries where this history is not taught, where being gay is still illegal, where queer people still face persecution. And in those places, the memory of Berlin is both a warning and a promise. A warning of what can happen. A promise that resistance is possible. Because the men who lived through Weimar Berlin did not give up. Even after the bars were closed. Even after the arrests began. Even after the camps opened. Some of them kept resisting. Some of them kept surviving. Some of them kept believing that another world was possible. And they were right. The world did change. Not in their lifetimes. But it changed. And it changed because they refused to disappear. Because they insisted on being remembered. Because they left behind fragments that could be pieced together into a story. And because that story, once told, could not be untold. That is the power of memory. It keeps people alive. It preserves their struggles. It connects past to present. It gives meaning to suffering. And it provides a foundation for future fights. So tonight, as you drift towards sleep, remember Berlin. Remember the men who walked into unmarked bars and found community. Remember the men who organized and published and lobbied for change. Remember the men who loved each other openly in a city that briefly allowed it. And remember what happened when that city fell. Remember that visibility is powerful and dangerous, that community is necessary and fragile, that rights can be won and lost, that history does not move in a straight line toward justice, that progress requires vigilance, that memory is a form of resistance. And remember that the world we live in now, where gay marriage is legal in many countries, where pride parades happen every year, where queer people can live openly in many places, is not inevitable. It was built by people who fought, who organized, who refused to stay silent, who planted seeds knowing they might not live to see the harvest. We are living in the harvest, and we owe it to the people who planted those seeds to remember them, to speak their names, to tell their stories, to preserve their history, and to continue their fight. Because the fight is not over. In too many places, queer people still live in fear, still face violence, still risk death for loving who they love. And in those places, the memory of Berlin is a lifeline. It says, you are not the first. Others have fought before you. Others have built communities before you. Others have survived before you. And we will not let you be forgotten. That is what memory does. It connects the isolated to a larger story. It says, you are part of something bigger than yourself. You are part of a struggle that has been going on for generations, and that struggle matters. The men who built Berlin's gay world did not know they were making history. They were just trying to live. But their lives mattered. Their love mattered. Their courage mattered. And their memory matters. So we remember them. We say their names when we know them. We honor the anonymous when we do not. We preserve the fragments. We tell the stories. We build the memorials. And we carry forward the work they began. Because that is what the living owe the dead. Not pity, not sentimentality, but continuity. The promise that their fight will not be forgotten, that their lives will not be erased, that the world they tried to build, even if it was destroyed, will be remembered as proof that another way of living is possible. Berlin from 1919 to 1933 was not paradise. It was not perfect, but it was a glimpse of what the world could be. A city where gay men could live openly, where they could build community, where they could love without hiding. And that glimpse, brief as it was, changed everything. Because once people have seen that such a world is possible, they cannot unsee it. They cannot accept less. They cannot stop fighting for it. That is the legacy of Berlin. Not the destruction, not the camps, not the silence that followed, but the 15 years when it was possible, when the bars were open, when the magazines were published, when men danced together, when they loved openly, when they believed, even if only for a moment, that the world was changing. They were right. The world was changing, just not fast enough to save them, but their vision survived. And we are living in the world they imagined, imperfect, incomplete, still threatened, but real. So tonight, as you settle into sleep, think of a man walking down Motzstrasse in 1927. Think of him pausing outside an unmarked door. Think of him taking a breath and walking down the stairs. Think of him entering a room full of men like him. Think of the feeling of being found. And then think of that same man 5 years later. The door locked, the bar closed, the community scattered, the fear, the silence, the loss. Hold both of those images, the joy and the loss, the community and the destruction, the hope and the grief. Because that is the truth of this history. It is not a simple story. It is not a story with a happy ending. But it is a story that matters. It matters because those men mattered. Because their lives were valuable. Because their love was real. Because they built something worth remembering. And because their story is a reminder that the world we live in is not guaranteed. That freedom is fragile. That rights can be taken away. That vigilance is required. That memory is necessary. If this story stayed with you, the like button helps the channel reach others who would love it too. May your dreams tonight be full of unmarked doors that open into rooms full of people who understand you. May you find community in the places you least expect it. May you live openly enough that someone 100 years from now will find evidence of your existence and know that you were here. And may the world you wake up in tomorrow be a little more just than the one you fell asleep in, because people like you refuse to stay silent. Good night, and sleep well.